Charles Whitmore kicked a rusted oil pan across my garage floor and called the place a dump. His assistant held up an HOA violation notice beside my daughter's bicycle, right where my property deed, custody papers, and workshop permit hung on the wall. The notice gave me 72 hours before a forced inspection could shut down my garage, block my driveway access, and delay 3 neighborhood repair contracts waiting on my workbench. What Charles did not understand was simple. I controlled the only working access gate to the rear service road, the licensed fabrication permit, and the custom prototype hidden beneath the canvas behind him. The oil pan spun once and stopped under the yellow work light. My daughter, Maya, stood near the back door with her school backpack still on one shoulder. The room smelled like motor oil, sawdust, warm metal, and rain dripping from the tin roof. Charles looked around as if the air itself offended him. His shoes were too polished for my floor. His white coat stayed clean even while everyone else tracked mud in from the driveway. "This is what is blocking my development entrance?" he asked. Nobody answered. His men stood behind him with tablets and folded maps. One of them took pictures of my shelves, my tools, my cracked concrete floor, and the old fan turning slowly above us. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped between the camera and Maya. I was 38, black, a single father, and too tired to mistake insult for business. "You are standing in my garage," I said. Charles smiled without warmth. "I am standing in wasted space." The words landed flat. Maya looked down at her shoes. That made my grip tighten around the rag. I did not raise my voice. I had learned a long time ago that some men heard volume before truth. "You can leave the notice on the table," I said. "And you can stop photographing my child." The assistant lowered the tablet. Charles glanced at Maya, then back at me. For half a second, something like annoyance crossed his face. Not guilt. Annoyance. He had expected me to beg, explain, or get angry. I did none of those things. Rain tapped harder against the roof. Water slid down the garage window in crooked lines. Behind Charles, the canvas covering my largest project shifted slightly from the draft under the door. He noticed. His eyes narrowed. "What is that?" I moved before he did, crossing the floor and placing one hand on the edge of the canvas. "Customer property. Looks like junk. Then you should have no reason to touch it." The room changed after that. One of his men stopped typing. Another looked from Charles to the covered object. Maya held her breath. I heard it more than saw it. Charles took one slow step closer. "Mr. Walker, everyone has a price. Not everything is for sale." His smile faded. That was the first honest thing he showed me. He turned toward the wall where my permits hung beside Maya's spelling award and an old photo of my father. His eyes paused on the fabrication license. Then on the stamped engineering approval beneath it. The billionaire finally stopped looking at the mess. He started looking at the system around it. Outside, another black SUV rolled into my driveway. The second SUV stopped beside the first and splashed rainwater across the gravel. Nobody got out right away. The engine idled. The headlights washed pale light across my garage door. Charles watched through the open entrance. So did his assistants. The sound of the rain filled the silence between us. Then the rear door opened. A gray-haired man stepped out carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. He was not dressed like the others. No expensive overcoat. No polished smile. Just work boots and a dark jacket spotted with rain. His eyes moved past the vehicles, past Charles, and straight toward the covered project behind me. That caught my attention. It caught Charles's attention too. The man entered the garage slowly. He wiped rain from his glasses and stopped beside the workbench. The smell of wet pavement drifted in with him. Maya shifted closer to me. The new arrival nodded politely. "Darius Walker, he asked. That is me. He offered his hand. Elliot Barnes. The name meant nothing to Charles. I could tell by his face. It meant something to me. Not because he was famous. Because he was one of the few clients who never asked for discounts. He respected craftsmanship. That alone made him memorable. Elliot placed the portfolio on the workbench. Water dripped from the edge onto the wood. I came to check the progress, he said. Charles glanced at the canvas again. Progress on what? Elliot looked at him. You are Charles Whitmore. The answer usually changed conversations. This time it did not. Elliot simply nodded once and returned his attention to me. A small detail. A useful one. Charles noticed it too. The billionaire was accustomed to entering rooms as the most important person present. For the second time that afternoon, something had not gone according to plan. Elliot opened the portfolio and slid several drawings across the workbench. Maya leaned forward. I recognized every page immediately. Technical sketches. Measurements. Material notes. Months of work lived inside those sheets. Charles stepped closer. His eyes scanned the drawings. The confidence on his face softened slightly. Only slightly. These came from here, he asked. Elliot looked surprised by the question. Of course they did. Rain rattled against the roof. One of Charles's assistants stopped taking notes. Another lowered his phone. The garage suddenly felt smaller. More crowded. More focused. Elliot pointed toward the covered project. Can I see it? I nodded. Charles watched carefully. Too carefully. His curiosity had finally defeated his contempt. I pulled back one corner of the canvas. Just enough. Metal reflected the yellow shop light. Precision machine surfaces emerged from the shadows. Not decorative. Not ordinary. Purpose-built. Elliot smiled immediately. Beautiful work. Charles said nothing. That silence told me more than any question could. He had expected scrap. He had expected clutter. He had expected proof that he was right. Instead he was seeing something else. Maya looked up at me. Her eyes were brighter now. The tension in her shoulders eased a little. She had spent the entire afternoon listening to strangers judge a place they did not understand. Now someone was speaking a different language. Respect. Elliot carefully replaced the canvas himself. He treated it like something valuable. Then he gathered the drawings and slid them back into the portfolio. We should talk tomorrow, he said quietly. There are people who need to see this. Charles followed the portfolio with his eyes until it disappeared beneath Elliot's arm. For the first time since arriving, the billionaire looked less certain than before. Then Elliot mentioned a name that changed the room completely. Darius wiped a thin line of rainwater from the workbench with the edge of his rag. Nobody spoke for a second after Elliot mentioned the name. Even the rain seemed quieter. Charles looked directly at him. Who needs to see it? He asked. Elliot closed the portfolio. The people funding the harbor transit retrofit. One of Charles's assistants looked up immediately. Another exchanged a quick glance with him. That reaction did not escape Elliot. It did not escape me either. Maya stood near the tool cabinet, watching every face in the room. She had learned long ago that adults often revealed more through silence than words. Charles folded his arms. I know that project. I assumed you did, Elliot replied. The answer sounded polite. It did not sound submissive. The smell of machine oil mixed with damp air drifting through the open garage door. Water dripped steadily from the roof outside. Somewhere down the street, a truck rolled through a puddle. The sound faded quickly. Inside the garage, nobody seemed interested in leaving. Elliot tapped the portfolio lightly. The design team has spent months trying to solve a fabrication problem. Charles glanced toward the covered project again. And you think he solved it? Elliot looked at me. I know he solved it. The sentence landed harder than a raised voice ever could. Maya smiled before she could stop herself. Charles noticed. He looked at her, then back at me. Something was changing behind his eyes. Not respect. Not yet. Curiosity. Real curiosity. That was new. One of his assistants stepped closer to the workbench. Why would a project like that come through a garage? He asked. I folded the rag and set it beside a wrench. Because garages still build things. The assistant opened his mouth, then closed it. Elliot hid a small smile. The old fan overhead continued its slow rotation. The blades clicked every few seconds. A familiar sound. One I barely noticed anymore. Charles walked toward the wall of shelves near the back. He examined boxes of components, labeled drawers, metal samples, and stacks of notebooks. His expression grew more focused with every step. He had entered expecting clutter. Now he was finding organization. Not expensive organization. Working organization. The kind built over years. His gaze stopped on a row of binders. What are these? Project logs. All of them. Every one. Maya reached for a soda from the small refrigerator and quietly handed it to me. I thanked her. She stayed close. The billionaire looked at the binders again. There were dozens. Some worn. Some newer. Each marked by year. Each filled with sketches, measurements, revisions, and failures. Elliot glanced toward them and nodded. That is one reason I trust his work. Charles ran a finger across one binder's spine. Dust collected on his fingertip. He looked almost surprised by it. As if serious work was not supposed to leave fingerprints behind. Outside, the rain began easing. The sound softened across the metal roof. A pale strip of evening light appeared beneath the clouds. Elliot checked his watch. I should get moving. He picked up the portfolio and turned toward me. Tomorrow morning. I will be here. Good. He started toward the door. Then stopped. Bring the blueprints. Charles followed him with his eyes. Blueprints? Elliot looked back. The original ones. Another small silence settled across the room. Charles did not miss it. Neither did his assistants. The billionaire had arrived believing he understood exactly what stood inside this garage. Now every answer seemed to create two new questions. Elliot stepped outside and disappeared into the rain-soaked evening. A moment later his SUV pulled away. The taillights vanished around the corner. Charles remained where he was. He looked at the covered project. Then at the binders. Then at the engineering approval hanging beside Maya's award certificate. The confidence he had worn earlier no longer fit quite as comfortably. Finally he turned toward me. I think we need another conversation. Then his phone rang. Charles glanced at the phone screen and answered immediately. The change in his posture was subtle but real. His shoulders straightened. His voice lowered. What happened? He asked. Nobody else spoke. Rainwater still dripped from the edge of the roof outside. Maya sat on a stool near the workbench and quietly opened one of her schoolbooks. She pretended to read. She was listening to every word. Charles turned away from us and walked toward the garage entrance. How long has it been delayed? He asked into the phone. A pause followed. Then another. His expression tightened. One of his assistants shifted nervously. Another checked his tablet. Something larger than this garage had suddenly entered the conversation. I leaned against the workbench and waited. The smell of machine oil and wet wood filled the room. The old fan clicked overhead. Charles ended the call and stood still for a moment. He looked out toward the darkening street. Then he turned back around. The confidence was still there, but now it carried weight. "There is a problem at the harbor project," he said. Elliot's words from earlier drifted through my mind. The design team. The fabrication problem. The original blueprints. Pieces were beginning to move together. "That sounds expensive," I said. One assistant almost smiled before catching himself. Charles ignored the comment. He stepped closer to the workbench. "How long have you been working with Elliot Barnes?" "A few years." "On projects like this?" "Sometimes." He looked at the covered machine again. Curiosity had become determination. He wanted answers now. Maya quietly turned a page in her book. The paper rustled softly. Charles noticed her again. This time his expression softened for a second. Only a second. Then it disappeared. "Your daughter spends a lot of time here," he said. "This is home," Maya answered before I could speak. The garage became quiet. Charles looked around the room. The shelves. The tools. The old refrigerator. The framed photograph of my father. The worn workbench with decades of scratches across its surface. He was seeing more than a business now. He was seeing a life. Outside. Another vehicle slowed near the property before continuing down the road. Headlights swept briefly across the walls. One of Charles's assistants cleared his throat. "Sir, we should probably head back." Charles did not move. "Not yet." That answer surprised everyone. Including me. He approached the shelf containing several prototype models. Small pieces. Metal components. Test assemblies. Failed experiments. He picked up one of the parts and examined it carefully. Not with contempt. With attention. "You made all of these?" he asked. "Most of them." "And the larger project?" "Also mine." He set the component back exactly where he found it. Another small detail. Another change. People reveal themselves through habits. Earlier he kicked an oil pan across the floor. Now he handled a prototype as if it mattered. The rain finally stopped. Evening light filtered through the windows. Golden light mixed with the yellow glow of the work lamps. Dust drifted through the air. Maya closed her book and stretched. "Dad, are we still having spaghetti tonight?" she asked. "That is the plan." "Good." She smiled. The tension in the room eased for a moment. Even one assistant laughed quietly. Charles looked at Maya and then at me. "You really plan to stay here through all of this?" he asked. "I built this place. Even if the pressure increases." I folded the shop rag and set it beside the toolbox. "Especially then." Charles held my gaze longer than before. Something behind his eyes was working through information he had not expected to find. Then his assistant's tablet chimed. Everyone looked down at the screen. The expression on the assistant's face changed immediately. The assistant stared at the tablet for several seconds before speaking. "Sir," the engineering review board responded. Charles extended his hand immediately. The tablet changed owners. The garage became silent except for the slow-turning fan above us. Maya watched from her stool. I watched Charles. His eyes moved across the screen once. Then again. The expression on his face tightened. Not anger. Concentration. One of the assistants stepped closer. "What did they say?" Charles did not answer right away. That hesitation told its own story. Outside, the wet pavement reflected the last light of evening. Water still dripped from the roof in steady intervals. The smell of rain lingered in the air. Finally Charles lowered the tablet. They want another review session tomorrow morning. The assistant frowned. That is unusual. Yes. Charles looked toward the covered project. Apparently it is. Nobody spoke for a moment. Maya slid off the stool and carried her book toward the small office area near the back. Her footsteps were light. Familiar. The kind that disappear into a place that feels like home. Charles followed her movement with his eyes. Then he looked around the garage again. The shelves. The tools. The unfinished projects. The old coffee maker near the window. Earlier he had seen disorder. Now he seemed to be searching for something else. A pattern. A reason. A hidden connection. How many people work here? He asked. Just me. One assistant looked surprised. Another glanced toward the covered machine. The numbers in his head were probably no longer matching the assumptions he had arrived with. Charles walked toward a shelf containing framed photographs. Most showed completed projects. Some showed customers. One showed Maya holding a fishing rod almost as tall as she was. Another showed my father standing beside the original garage sign years ago. Charles paused there longer than expected. Your father started this place? He asked. He did. And you kept it running? Every day. The answer was simple. The silence afterward was not. The billionaire nodded slowly. Somewhere beyond the neighborhood, a train horn echoed through the evening air. The sound drifted across the city and faded. One of Charles's assistants checked his watch again. Sir, the board meeting starts at 8. I know. Yet he still did not leave. That was becoming a pattern too. His attention kept returning to the covered project. The thing he had dismissed before seeing it. Curiosity can be stubborn once it takes hold. Maya returned carrying 3 paper plates. Dinner is almost ready, she said. The smell reached us a second later. Garlic. Tomato sauce. Warm bread. The garage suddenly felt less like a workshop and more like a home. Charles seemed caught off guard by that. Wealth often creates distance from ordinary moments. Here, there was no distance. Just a father trying to finish work before dinner. Maya set the plates down on a small folding table. One assistant smiled despite himself. Another looked uncomfortable, as if he had accidentally stepped into a private memory. Charles glanced at the table. Then at me. You were planning to continue working tonight? Of course. Even with everything happening? I shrugged. Deadlines do not disappear. That answer earned the faintest smile from him. The first genuine one. Small. Brief. Real. Then a vehicle turned into the driveway. Headlights swept through the garage entrance. Everyone looked outside. A black pickup truck rolled slowly across the gravel and stopped near the gate. The engine shut off. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out carrying a long tube case under one arm. Elliot Barnes had not mentioned anyone else coming. Yet the moment she appeared, Charles recognized her immediately. His reaction was impossible to miss. Charles recognized her before anyone else spoke. His eyes widened slightly. That reaction alone told me she mattered. The woman crossed the gravel driveway with steady steps. Rainwater glistened on the shoulders of her dark jacket. The long tube case rested comfortably under one arm. She moved like someone used to job sites, not boardrooms. Maya looked up from the folding table. Do you know her? She whispered. I think Charles does, I said. The woman entered the garage and stopped beside the workbench. The smell of wet pavement followed her inside. She set the tube case down carefully and offered her hand. Darius Walker. That is me. Rachel Monroe. The name immediately explained Charles's reaction. Rachel Monroe was one of the most respected structural engineers in the state. She advised major transportation projects across the region. More importantly, she rarely wasted time. If she drove across town after sunset, there was a reason. Charles stepped forward. Rachel. She nodded politely. Charles. No smile. No small talk. Just recognition. Her attention shifted back to me. Elliot called. She tapped the tube case. He said I should see something with my own eyes. One assistant quietly lowered his tablet. Another stopped checking emails. The room had become a meeting nobody expected. Rachel unlatched the case and removed several large blueprint sheets. She spread them across the workbench. The paper crackled beneath her hands. Maya stepped closer. Even she understood something important was happening. Rachel pointed to a section near the center. This is the connection assembly causing delays. I recognized it immediately. Charles did too. His expression confirmed it. Rachel traced several lines with her finger. Every proposed solution has failed cost review, stress testing, or manufacturing requirements. The garage fell silent. The old fan clicked overhead. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break apart. Rachel looked directly at me. Elliot says you solved it. Charles watched my face. So did everyone else. I reached beneath the workbench and pulled out a worn binder. The cover showed years of use. Scratches. Stains. Bent corners. Nothing impressive from the outside. I opened it and flipped through dozens of pages filled with sketches, calculations, revisions, and notes. Rachel leaned forward. Charles did the same. A few pages later I stopped. Here. I rotated the binder toward her. Rachel studied the drawing. Her eyes narrowed. Then she reached for one of the blueprints and compared dimensions. The room remained completely quiet. Even Maya seemed afraid to interrupt the moment. Rachel checked a second measurement. Then a third. Her expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Professionals often react that way when they discover something significant. Interesting, she said softly. Charles folded his arms. Interesting. Rachel ignored him. She continued reading. Another page turned. Then another. Several minutes passed. Nobody moved. Finally she looked up. How long ago did you design this? About 18 months. Rachel blinked. One assistant nearly dropped his tablet. Charles stared at me. 18 months. I nodded. The problem was public. Rachel carefully closed the binder. Not publicly solved. The distinction mattered. The smell of garlic and bread drifted from the small office area. Dinner sat forgotten on the table. Maya looked from Rachel to me and back again. She already knew this story. She had watched those late nights. The yellow work light burning long after midnight. The notebooks. The calculations. The failed prototypes. The long hours nobody else ever saw. Rachel rested one hand on the binder. I need copies of everything. Charles slowly exhaled. For the first time since arriving, he looked less like a billionaire evaluating property and more like a man realizing he had walked into the wrong story. Then Rachel turned one page back and froze at a handwritten note in the margin. Rachel stared at the handwritten note for several seconds. Nobody interrupted her. The old fan continued its slow clicking above us. The yellow work light cast soft shadows across the open binder. Maya stood beside the folding table with her hands wrapped around a glass of water. Charles remained near the workbench, watching every movement. Rachel finally touched the margin with one finger. Who wrote this? She asked. I did. She looked up immediately. You tested the thermal expansion variables yourself? 3 times. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Without access to the official modeling software. I had graph paper. One of the assistants quietly laughed before realizing nobody else was laughing. The room returned to silence. Rachel looked back down at the note. The handwriting was messy. The paper carried oil stains and pencil marks from countless revisions. Yet the calculations were clear. She flipped through several more pages. The same pattern appeared again and again. Observations. Corrections. Measurements. Small handwritten solutions scattered between larger designs. Not the work of someone guessing. The work of someone refusing to stop. Outside, the clouds had finally broken apart. A strip of moonlight reflected off puddles in the driveway. The garage felt smaller now. Not physically. Emotionally. Too many important people had suddenly become interested in one old binder. Rachel stopped at another page. This recommendation was never published. No, then how did you reach it? I pointed toward a shelf near the back wall. Everyone followed my hand. Several cardboard boxes sat stacked beside old equipment. Nothing impressive. Nothing expensive. Rachel understood before anyone else. Testing records, she asked. Years of them. Charles slowly turned toward the boxes. He had spent most of the afternoon looking at the visible parts of the garage. The shelves. The tools. The machinery. Now he was beginning to understand that the most valuable things in the room were paper, patience, and time. Maya smiled faintly. She knew those boxes better than anyone. She had helped label many of them. Dad never throws notes away, she said. Rachel laughed softly. Good. The sound eased the tension for a moment. One assistant stepped closer to the shelf. All of those relate to engineering projects. Most of them. How many? I thought for a second. A few hundred. His eyes widened. Charles said nothing. He simply looked around the garage again. But this time he was not seeing a building. He was seeing accumulated years. Thousands of hours hidden behind ordinary walls. Rachel carefully closed the binder and rested both hands on the cover. Do you understand what this means? She asked. Probably not the same way you do. That answer earned another smile. Fair enough. She glanced toward Charles. The board has spent months searching for alternatives. Charles nodded slowly. I know. Then you know how significant this could become. The billionaire looked down at the binder. Earlier he had called this place a dump. That memory now hung in the room without anyone mentioning it. Some mistakes become louder with time. Maya carried a plate to the workbench and pushed it toward me. Your dinner is getting cold. Thank you. Rachel stepped back to give us room. The simple gesture changed something. For the first time all evening, nobody was discussing permits, projects, developments, or engineering reviews. We were just people standing in a garage at dinner time. The smell of tomato sauce drifted through the air again. Warm. Familiar. Human. Charles looked at the plate. Then at Maya. Then at me. The distance between worlds seemed smaller than before. His assistant's tablet chimed once more. The young man checked the screen and immediately froze. Rachel noticed first. What is it? The assistant swallowed. Someone already knows about the design. Everyone in the garage looked at him. The assistant looked down at the tablet again as if hoping the message would change. It did not. The glow from the screen reflected across his face. Everyone waited. The garage felt unusually still. Even the fan seemed quieter. Who knows? Charles asked. His voice was calm, but the question carried weight. The assistant swallowed. Someone from the review committee requested the file summary 15 minutes ago. Rachel frowned immediately. That should not have happened. Charles stepped closer. Why not? Rachel crossed her arms. Because nobody outside the board was supposed to know a solution existed. The silence returned. Maya looked from face to face. She did not understand every detail, but she understood enough. Something private was becoming public. The smell of dinner still floated through the garage, but nobody seemed interested in eating now. The assistant scrolled through the message again. There is more. Charles held out his hand. The tablet changed owners. His eyes moved across the screen. Then his expression shifted. Just slightly. What? Rachel asked. Charles looked up. The request came from someone connected to North Point Development. The name landed heavily. One assistant looked away. Another lowered his head. Rachel's expression hardened. That explains it. I recognized the company. Most people in the city did. Large projects. Large influence. Large budgets. Charles stared at the screen for another moment. Then he handed it back. They move quickly. Rachel laughed once. There was no humor in it. That is one way to describe them. Outside, a light breeze pushed through the open garage entrance. The air smelled cleaner now. The rain had finally passed. Moonlight reflected off wet pavement. Maya quietly gathered the plates from the folding table and carried them toward the office area. Nobody stopped her. She understood when adults needed space. Rachel looked toward me. Have you shown this design to anyone besides Elliot? No, no investors. No, no companies. No, she nodded slowly. That answer seemed important. Charles turned toward the covered project again. The machine sat exactly where it had all evening. Hidden beneath canvas. Quiet. Unassuming. Yet somehow it had become the center of multiple conversations happening far beyond this garage. That realization seemed to bother him. Not because the project existed. Because he had nearly overlooked it completely. One of the assistants checked his phone. There are already rumors online. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. Of course there are. Charles walked toward the shelves and stopped near the old photograph of my father. For several seconds he studied it. Then he looked around the garage once more. The tools. The notebooks. The boxes of records. The worn workbench. He was building a different picture now. Not of a property. Not of a development obstacle. A different picture entirely. Maya returned carrying a small notebook. Dad, she asked. What is it? She handed it to me. You left this in the truck last week. I looked down at the cover and immediately recognized it. One of my older field journals. Rachel noticed. Can I see that? She asked. I handed it over. She opened the notebook carefully. The pages contained site sketches, observations, measurements, and handwritten thoughts collected over years. Nothing organized. Nothing polished. Just work. Real work. Rachel flipped through several pages. Then she stopped. This predates the harbor project. By a lot. Her eyes moved across another page. Then another. A slow smile appeared. Not excitement. Recognition. You were studying the problem before the project even existed. Charles heard that. So did everyone else. The room grew quiet again. Some discoveries arrive all at once. Others arrive piece by piece until the full picture becomes impossible to ignore. Rachel closed the notebook and looked directly at me. There is something here nobody has seen yet. Then she turned to a page near the back and pointed to a sketch dated 7 years earlier. Everyone leaned closer to the notebook. Rachel kept one finger on the page as if she wanted to make sure it did not disappear. The paper was old. The edges had yellowed slightly with time. Pencil marks crossed the margins. Coffee stains covered one corner. Nothing about it looked important at first glance. Yet nobody looked away. The garage felt smaller again. The work lights hummed softly overhead. Outside, the night had settled completely across the neighborhood. Rachel tapped the sketch. 7 years ago, she asked. About that. Charles stepped beside the workbench. His assistants followed. Maya stood near my shoulder. She already knew what was in many of the notebooks. She had watched me fill them for years. Rachel studied the drawing again. Then she laid one of the harbor blueprints beside it. The comparison was immediate. Several lines matched almost perfectly. One assistant blinked twice before looking again. Charles leaned closer. That cannot be a coincidence. Rachel slowly nodded. It is not. The room fell silent. The old fan clicked overhead. The smell of machine oil lingered in the warm air. Rachel traced one section of the sketch with her finger. This is the same structural concept. She moved her hand to the blueprint. And this is the solution everyone has been trying to develop. Nobody spoke. Some truths arrive quietly. This one arrived like a weight settling onto the table. Charles looked at me. You started working on this 7 years before the project existed. Not the project. Then what? I glanced toward the shelves near the back wall. The problem. Rachel smiled. Not because it was funny. Because she understood. Engineers spend years thinking about questions most people never notice. Some problems stay in the back of the mind long after everyone else forgets them. Maya gently rested her hand on the notebook. Dad keeps ideas forever, she said. Rachel laughed softly. Apparently he does. One assistant shook his head. Why never show anyone? The answer seemed obvious to me. Nobody asked. That response lingered in the room longer than expected. Charles lowered his eyes briefly. A small reaction. Easy to miss. Yet it was there. Earlier he had seen a garage. Then he saw a project. Then a collection of records. Now he was seeing years of unseen work. The difference mattered. Rachel carefully turned another page. More sketches appeared. More notes. More observations. The date stretched back farther than anyone expected. Some pages contained rough concepts. Others contained precise measurements. Several carried handwritten corrections added months later. A timeline of persistence. Nothing dramatic. Just steady effort repeated over and over. Rachel stopped at a folded insert tucked between 2 pages. She unfolded it carefully. A larger drawing appeared. Charles immediately recognized it. That is impossible. Rachel looked up. What? He pointed toward the paper. That configuration was proposed during a closed review 3 years ago. The assistants exchanged looks. Rachel examined the drawing. Then she looked at the date written in the corner. The paper predated that review by nearly 4 years. Nobody spoke. Maya glanced from one face to another. She could feel the room changing. Respect does not arrive all at once. It accumulates. Piece by piece. Evidence by evidence. Rachel folded the insert and placed it back inside the notebook. Tomorrow is going to be interesting, she said quietly. Charles nodded. There was no argument left in him now. Only questions. Outside, a distant siren echoed somewhere across the city before fading into the night. The garage felt calm despite everything. Familiar. Safe. Yet the conversation had moved far beyond these walls. Rachel closed the notebook and rested both hands on it. There is one thing I still do not understand. Everyone looked at her. She glanced toward the canvas-covered machine standing silently beneath the work light. Then she asked the question nobody else had considered. Every face in the garage turned toward the covered machine. Rachel's question seemed simple, yet nobody answered immediately. The canvas sat motionless beneath the yellow work light. Shadows stretched across the concrete floor. Outside, the neighborhood had gone quiet. Even the occasional passing car had disappeared. Maya looked toward the machine and smiled slightly. She already knew the answer. Rachel noticed. "You know something," she said gently. Maya shrugged. "Maybe." That earned a few tired smiles around the room. The tension eased for a moment. Then Rachel looked back at me. If all of this work was focused on solving the structural problem, why build a full prototype? The smell of warm metal still lingered in the air. I walked slowly toward the covered project. Years of effort sat beneath that canvas. Years of failures too. The successful parts always attract attention. The failures are usually forgotten. Because drawings are easy, I said. Reality is harder. Rachel nodded immediately. She understood. Charles remained silent. His attention never left the machine. Earlier he had dismissed it without a second thought. Now it had become the center of the room. I pulled the canvas back farther than before. Metal surfaces reflected the light. Precision machine components emerged from the shadows. Complex joints. Reinforced connections. Adjustable assemblies. Nothing flashy. Nothing decorative. Every piece served a purpose. Rachel stepped forward first. She crouched beside one section and examined it closely. Her eyes widened. Then she moved to another area. Then another. "You built all of this yourself?" "Most of it." One assistant stared openly. Another took a slow step closer. Nobody reached out to touch anything. Respect had replaced curiosity. Charles approached last. He stopped several feet away. The machine reflected softly in his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Rachel pointed toward one assembly. "This is the configuration from the notebook. Version 6. You tested 6 versions." Maya laughed quietly. "Way more than 6. Rachel looked at her. "How many?" Maya thought for a moment. "I stopped counting after 20. The room became silent again. Charles slowly exhaled. The sound was almost lost beneath the hum of the lights. 20 versions. 20 attempts. 20 rounds of learning from mistakes nobody else ever saw. Rachel walked around the machine carefully. "This is not just a prototype. No, this is years of development." "Yes." She nodded. The distinction mattered. One assistant lowered his head and rubbed the back of his neck. Another stared at the floor. The atmosphere had changed completely from the moment they first entered the garage. Back then they saw clutter. Now they saw evidence. Outside, moonlight reflected through the open doorway and stretched across the concrete floor. The old garage looked exactly the same. Yet somehow everything felt different. Charles finally spoke. "Why keep it here?" The question carried no judgment this time. Only genuine curiosity. I rested one hand against the edge of the machine. The metal felt cool. Familiar. "Because this is where it belongs." He looked around the garage again. The shelves. The notebooks. The tools. The photographs. The workbench. The years. Understanding settled across his face little by little. Not all at once. Some lessons arrive slowly. Rachel reached into her jacket pocket and removed her phone. She looked at the machine one more time before opening a message. Tomorrow morning is going to change several conversations. One assistant nodded. Probably careers too. Rachel did not disagree. Maya quietly moved beside me. The garage suddenly felt peaceful despite everything waiting outside those walls. Then Charles looked directly at the machine and asked the one question nobody else had considered asking all evening. Charles looked directly at the machine and asked, "If this works, why did you never try to sell it?" The question settled over the garage. Nobody moved. Rachel looked up from her phone. The assistants waited. Even Maya turned toward me. The answer seemed obvious to me, but judging by their expressions, it was not obvious to anyone else. I rested my hand on the edge of the prototype. Cool metal. Years of work. Years of mistakes. Years of learning. Because I was not trying to sell it, I said. Charles frowned slightly. Then what were you trying to do? Finish it. The room grew quiet again. Rachel smiled before looking back at the machine. She understood. Some people chase markets. Some chase answers. They are not the same thing. One assistant slowly nodded as if a piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. Maya sat down on the old stool again. She looked tired now. The long evening was catching up with everyone. Outside, the moonlight painted silver streaks across the wet driveway. The neighborhood remained calm. Peaceful. A sharp contrast to the conversations happening inside the garage. Charles walked around the prototype one more time. His expensive shoes clicked softly against the concrete floor. Earlier he had moved through the garage like a man inspecting a problem. Now he moved through it like someone visiting a museum. Careful. Observant. Respectful. Rachel opened her phone again. The board is already asking questions. One assistant sighed. Tomorrow is going to be a circus. Probably, Rachel said. Charles stopped beside the workbench. His eyes landed on the old photograph of my father once more. The frame was scratched. The picture had faded slightly over the years. Yet it remained one of the first things people noticed when they spent enough time in the garage. Your father saw this? Charles asked. I nodded. The early versions. What did he think? A faint smile crossed my face. He said version 3 looked like it wanted to fall apart. Maya laughed immediately. That sounds like Grandpa. It does. Even Rachel smiled. The atmosphere softened. For a moment there were no billionaires. No review boards. No development companies. Just people sharing a story. Then Charles looked back at the prototype. And version 20? Maya answered before I could. He said Dad was finally getting somewhere. That drew another round of quiet laughter. The sound echoed gently through the garage. Small moments matter. Especially after long days. Rachel glanced toward the stack of notebooks near the shelf. Those records need protection. One assistant immediately nodded. Agreed. Charles looked at the notebooks too. You should document everything. Already did. Not just for yourself. I understood what he meant. The work had reached a point where it belonged to larger conversations. Bigger rooms. Bigger decisions. Bigger consequences. Yet standing there beside the old workbench, it still felt personal. Rachel slipped her phone back into her jacket pocket. The review board meeting starts at 8. Charles checked his watch. Which means we leave in less than 10 hours. Nobody seemed excited about that. The garage had become strangely comfortable. Familiar. Honest. The outside world felt louder somehow. Maya yawned and rubbed her eyes. Rachel noticed first. Someone should be asleep. Maya pointed at the adults. You first. That earned another smile from nearly everyone. Then a new message appeared on Charles's phone. He glanced down. The color drained from his face for the first time all night. He looked up slowly. They just moved the meeting forward. Charles lowered the phone slowly. Nobody spoke. The garage felt completely still. The old fan continued its steady clicking overhead. Maya looked up from her stool. Rachel crossed her arms. One assistant finally broke the silence. How much earlier? Charles glanced at the screen again. 6:30. Rachel checked her watch immediately. They are trying to control the room before everyone arrives. Charles nodded once. That was my first thought. The assistants exchanged uneasy looks. Outside, moonlight reflected across the wet driveway. The rainstorm felt like a distant memory now. The air smelled clean. Calm. Yet the mood inside the garage had shifted. Something important was moving faster than expected. Rachel looked toward the notebook stacked near the shelf. Then she looked at the prototype. Then at me. They know enough to be nervous. I leaned against the workbench. Good. That answer surprised one of the assistants. Rachel smiled faintly. I was hoping you would say that. Maya looked between us. Why is everyone nervous? She asked. Charles turned toward her. His voice softened. Because sometimes people make decisions before they have all the facts. Maya considered that for a moment. That sounds like a bad idea. Nobody argued. The garage filled with quiet laughter. Even Charles smiled. Small moments like that had become common during the evening. The distance between strangers had shrunk. Rachel stepped toward the prototype again. Her eyes moved across the metal framework. Tomorrow is not really about this machine anymore. One assistant nodded. It is about the records. And the timeline, Rachel added. And the proof. Charles looked toward the shelf containing years of notebooks. His expression had changed dramatically from when he first arrived. The skepticism was gone. So was the impatience. What remained was respect. Honest respect. He walked toward the shelf and carefully picked up one of the older journals. He held it for a moment before setting it back exactly where he found it. The gesture did not go unnoticed. People reveal themselves through small choices. Maya yawned again. Rachel pointed toward the office area. Seriously. Bed. Maya sighed dramatically. Everybody keeps saying that. Because everybody is right. Maya laughed and disappeared into the back room. Her footsteps faded. The garage suddenly felt quieter without her. Charles watched her go. Then he looked at me. You built more than a project here. The statement hung in the air. I glanced around the garage. The photographs. The workbench. The shelves. The notebooks. The prototype. I guess I did. Charles nodded slowly. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he surprised everyone. I owe you an apology. Nobody interrupted him. I walked in here this afternoon and saw what I expected to see. His eyes moved around the room. I never bothered to see what was actually here. Rachel looked away politely. The assistants remained silent. The apology felt genuine because it was simple. No excuses. No explanations. Just truth. I shrugged lightly. You are not the first. That does not make it right. The garage fell quiet again. Outside, a cool breeze drifted through the open entrance. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and then stopped. The city was settling into sleep. Rachel checked her phone. We should leave soon. Nobody argued. The night had become late. The morning would arrive quickly. Yet before anyone moved, Charles looked one final time at the prototype, then at the notebooks, then at the old photograph on the wall. Understanding settled across his face completely. Then Rachel's phone vibrated, and the message she read changed everything. Rachel stared at her phone for several seconds before looking up. The garage had grown completely quiet. Charles immediately noticed the expression on her face. "What happened?" he asked. Rachel locked the screen and slipped the phone into her jacket pocket. The board already reviewed the preliminary documents. One assistant blinked. "Tonight?" Rachel nodded. "Tonight." Nobody expected that. Charles slowly exhaled. The night had already delivered enough surprises. Apparently it was not finished. Outside, moonlight reflected across the wet pavement. The storm was gone. The air felt cleaner than it had all day. Maya stepped back into the garage wearing pajamas and carrying a blanket over one shoulder. She looked from face to face. "Good news or bad news?" Rachel smiled. "Good." Maya immediately smiled back. The tension softened. Rachel rested one hand on the binder lying open on the workbench. "The review board wants the original records presented first thing in the morning." One assistant laughed quietly. "That never happens." "Exactly," Rachel said. Charles looked toward the notebook stacked along the shelf. Years of work. Years of notes. Years of persistence. Nobody had paid much attention to them before. Now they had become the most important documents in the room. He walked slowly toward the shelf and ran his hand across the worn binder spines. Not possessively. Respectfully. "You spent years building this," he said. "Yes." "Without guarantees." "Yes." He nodded. There was nothing else to add. Some truths speak for themselves. Rachel gathered the blueprints carefully and slid them back into the tube case. Her movements were calm now. The uncertainty that existed earlier had disappeared. She had seen enough. Charles had too. One assistant helped organize the notebooks that would travel to the meeting. Another checked schedules and messages. The evening that began with doubt had somehow become a partnership. Not because anyone planned it. Because the evidence left no room for anything else. Maya sat beside the prototype and leaned her head against my arm. The garage lights reflected softly across the machine's metal frame. Years ago it had been an idea. Then a sketch. Then a failure. Then another failure. Then another. Now it stood quietly beneath the same roof where it had been imagined. Charles looked at the machine one final time. "I called this place a dump." Nobody responded. He shook his head. "I was wrong." The apology was simple. Honest. Complete. Rachel smiled faintly. One assistant looked embarrassed on behalf of everyone who had underestimated the garage. Another simply nodded. Outside, dawn was still hours away. Yet it felt as though a long night had already ended. Charles extended his hand. This time there was no hesitation from either of us. We shook hands beside the workbench. No cameras. No reporters. No audience. Just a quiet moment inside an old garage. Maya looked up and smiled. Rachel closed the final binder and secured the tube case. The room felt peaceful. The same shelves stood against the walls. The same tools rested where they always had. The same photograph of my father hung above the workbench. Nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. Charles headed toward the door with his assistants. Rachel followed behind them. Before stepping outside, she turned back once. "Tomorrow they will see what we saw tonight." Then she disappeared into the cool night air. The vehicles pulled away one by one. Their headlights faded down the street. Silence returned. Maya yawned. The fan clicked overhead. The garage smelled faintly of machine oil, rain, and cold spaghetti. I looked around the room that had carried every setback and every success. Then I switched off the work light. In the darkness, the old garage felt exactly like home.